Atlantis with the two groups of the Law of One and the sons of Belial, who came from the island of Arian. There were 5 islands in the end, and there could not be 2 better people to share Edgar Cayce's story of Atlantis than the next 2 people that you're going to hear from. And it is a real treat. It is a real honor for me. I have wanted to meet, and John can attest to this, Dr. Greg Little and Dr. Lora Little for a number of years. Definitely feel that connection. Wonderful people. But they're not just interpreters of Cayce. Dr. Lora Little and Dr. Greg Little led expeditions to the Sargasso Sea, to the area of Bimini where Cayce said one of the halls of records lie. They went there. They became scuba divers, and they looked, and then they went to an even more difficult place in Piedras Negras, Black Rock in Guatemala, and did some amazing research, and they'll talk more about that tomorrow. But it is an absolute honor to introduce to you Dr. Lora Little and Dr. Greg Little. Dr. Lora Little is on the board of the ARE Board of Trustees, and they are both psychologists, psychiatrists, remarkable people, kind people, and key members of our soul family. Can we have a standing ovation for Dr. Greg and Lora Little, please?
Thank you all very much. And Greg, I got a standing ovation. No, just kidding. When we were asked to do this presentation, we were going to do all separate stuff. If you know us very well, you know we work better separately, except for when we're doing our expeditions. We do meld really well in those. But we decided that for this one talk where we would come together is I would really do a lead-in for Greg. He's got a wonderful theory and a talk about mitochondrial DNA that you really have to hear. But in order to understand it, you need a little bit more of a lead-in to what was going on in Atlantis and about the migrations of Atlantis. And one of the things I've noticed today is that James is extremely knowledgeable about the Edgar Cayce readings and about Atlantis. In fact, you're going to see some things in my presentation that are similar, so we're going to get to go faster through those items. But basically what we're going to go through is, first of all, who was Edgar Cayce? And again, James has done a great job with that. Why Atlantis matters. Why the heck do we even care to go looking for Atlantis? Why do we pay all that money to go and take a boat over to the Bahamas or go to Guatemala? What's so important about Atlantis? And we're going to talk about Cayce's history of mankind. And he used the old term root races, but it's a really, really fascinating story and really kind of an odd story. And then we'll talk a lot about the Atlanteans, who they were. We'll talk about their 3 destructions, and then we'll talk about their migrations so that we can lead into Greg's talk. All right, who was Edgar Cayce? He was really an amazing person. He was a 20th century mystic and psychic. He's the most documented psychic and medical intuition in history. And the fact that he is so well documented is why we can go back and pour through those readings and be able to find this kind of information about Atlantis. But more importantly, about 80% of his readings were on medical issues, on healthcare. So he's considered the father of holistic medicine. And if you become a member of ARE, you will have access to a member section in the Edgar Cayce website, edgarcayce.org. And you will not have enough time in this lifetime to read all of the circulating files just on the medical issues, not to mention the non-medical. All right, but Cayce gave 14,000 readings. That's a lot of readings. And 700 of those readings have at least one reference to Atlantis. The first references occurred in a life reading, and then some other people later wanted to know a little bit more about it, so there's also some series of readings that you can get into. The 364 series is one of the best ones, where they ask some real specific questions about Atlantis. But a lot of the information comes from the large number of people who had life readings in Atlantis. So where was Atlantis? Well, both Cayce and Plato say it's in the Atlantic Ocean. Now, if you ask that question to a lot of other people these days, you'll hear it's in Spain, it's in Santorini. Just about every part of the country has a connection to Atlantis. They'll tell you that's where Atlantis was. And you know, if you have read Cayce's story about Atlantis, that's really not a surprise, because Atlanteans were not just locked into their island. They were connected to people all over the world. And that's part of the story I'm going to tell you about. So they didn't just sit on their island all the time, they got around. But Edgar Cayce is real specific. He says that Atlantis was actually in the Bahamas. In speaking of the records that the Atlanteans left behind, he says one set of the records is in the sunken portions of Atlantis or Poseidia, which is one of the islands that was left, where a portion of the temples may be discovered under the slime of ages of the sea water. And tomorrow you'll get to see a place that we think might be one of those temples that we found in the last few years. And it's just off the coast of Florida. Okay, so a little bit of a geography lesson here. You can see, let me get my pointer here. This is Florida. This is the little teeny tiny island of Bimini. Everywhere that you see sort of brownish color, that's land that's above water. And everywhere that you see really dark blue is really, really deep water. And then everywhere you see this light blue, you see it up here. This is called the Little Bahama Bank. It's about 15 to 20 feet deep. This is the Great Bahama Bank, and you can see that at one time, and in 10,000 BC, when Atlantis had its final destruction, that was an island. Everything that's light blue was above the sea level. So those were part of, according to Edgar Cayce, part of the islands of Atlantis, as was Cuba. All right, so why are we putting so much time and effort into Atlantis? Well, one of the things the Cayce readings tell us is, in order to know where we're going, we better know where we've been. You know, there's that great saying of, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. And the story of Atlantis is a really important story that relates directly to the times we're in right now. The readings also tell us that if we have an interest in Atlantis, guess what? We were probably had a past life in Atlantis. And he goes on further to say that there's some influence from that life affecting us in this life. So it's not just that we had that life in Atlantis, but we're working on something that we did back in those days. We're either using a talent that we had at that time, or maybe we're undoing some karma that we developed at that time. All right, but in the end, what's important about Atlantis, it's not where it was or how many people lived there or what those people were like, except if it has some value to our human family and if it has some value to our souls. And I do think the story of Atlantis does that. So really, in the Cayce readings, what he's telling us about Atlantis is the story of our own soul development. He tells us that with each entrance of our soul into the earth plane, we're here to complete a cycle. And ultimately, each life is to lead us closer to the infinite. He says all souls were created in the beginning and are finding their way back to whence they came. So we're going through a cycle. And I love this quote because it really describes the process. It's a circle or an arc, and it's a revolution. It's a cycle that we're going through. We started out from a divine source, and Cayce tells us this really interesting story about the 4 root races. As James mentioned earlier, we're in the 4th root race currently. But what about those other root races? What else was going on? Well, Cayce's story says that we were created in the beginning as spiritual beings, and we were able to co-create with God. We were totally connected to the infinite. And we found the earth plane. Some of us found the earth plane. And we thought this is a really interesting place. And so we decided to just kind of come in and check it out. We were ethereal beings, but it was just a fascinating place to us. And he tells us this was maybe sometime around 12 million BC. And he said that we were capable of that time, as James mentioned, of entering plant life, animal life, and even mineral life. I love this picture because I think that's what I would have done, would have been to go into a tree or some kind of plant. That would have been the thing I would have been attracted to. And what he goes further to say that they're moved by the Spirit to become that which they found. And they absorbed it into their being, and their being was absorbed as well into the plant, mineral, or animal life. And of course, that's a really interesting thing when you consider the power of gems. If there were people who were coming and going into those types of matter, did they leave an imprint? Or I say people, but souls. And so he ends up in that reading saying it was good and it was bad. It had its good side and its bad side. And part of its bad side was that we didn't just stop by going in and out. We started getting into things like propagation and self-preservation. He said that we began to multiply and really kind of got into having a good time. And gradually, as we began to do these things for our own amusement, we kind of got stuck. We began to harden. We began to find it was more difficult to come and go. And I like to think of that as, well, probably all of us have experienced going to a movie. And you go in the movie, and sometimes you can get so absorbed that when the movie ends and you walk out of the theater, you feel like you've been someplace else. And your mind is totally in that movie. You're identified with the characters. You've really pushed yourself. You've projected yourself onto that screen. People who play video games all day long and sometimes forget they have babies in cribs or they forget to eat. You know, we do have the capability to project our mind so totally, in such a focused way. All right, so then there's a second root race that we say maybe was around 10 million BC, and those were the Lemurians. Now, they were still spiritual, still partly able to come and go. They had sort of bodies like we experience now. We're not exactly sure. They had male and female in the same bodies. And some, in the past, I believed that Lemuria was separate from Atlantis, but actually in the readings, there's some overlap. It looks like that it did not totally end until probably around 20,000 BC or 28,000 BC. But their primary time factor was 10 million BC. And they were also still able to come and go. They partook of the carnal and had a continual hardening. And you notice in that circle, we're going down. And they began this de-evolution, this involution. And then around 200,000 BC, there came another race of Atlanteans. And these people, the Cayce readings describe as a thought people. These people had psychic abilities, but they also had the ability to create thought forms. And they had such great ability. They were beginning to harden. They had a hard time coming back and forth, but they still retained that spiritual connection to the point where they could really do some amazing, amazing things. In fact, one of the readings, the reading on the bottom, talks about that there was a person who got a reading who had been a teacher, and he studied psychology, but his study of psychological thought was the transmission of thought through the ethers. So obviously they were doing some amazing things. And then they also were able to develop more quickly, he says, than some of the other races because they could use the Earth's elements. They knew how to take in the Earth's elements and be able to make that a part of themselves. And part of the reason they could do that is they still understood their oneness with all things. Cayce says they had lots of talents. He said there was almost as many talents as there were different people. They could do a lot of things. They were musicians. They did ironwork. But as James mentioned earlier, as time went on in that 200,000 period, they started to polarize into two groups. There was the Sons of Belial group, who were really into using this power and ability that they had for their own selfish purposes, for power. He said that they really didn't care what kind of hardships they caused other people, and that really they had no standard of morality, that it was really all about self-aggrandizement. That's the first time, when I read the Cayce readings 30 some odd years ago, it was the first time I'd ever seen that word, self-aggrandizement. And I have pondered it for many years. I thought, what is that really like? Well, I can tell you today, I now understand exactly what self-aggrandizement is. And that's all I'll say about it. All right, and the other group, of course, was the Sons of the Law of One, which James also had talked about. They believed in one wife, one home, one state, one religion, one God, one purpose. And basically, they were involved, they were still connected to the spiritual source, and their philosophy was something Cayce called Christ consciousness. Tom Segru, who wrote Cayce's biography, There's a River, has really the best definition of Christ consciousness, and he asked Cayce in a reading, is this what you mean by Christ consciousness? And it's really a beautiful definition. I know some people like John Van Auken have it memorized. I almost do. But he says that Christ consciousness is the awareness within each soul of its oneness with God, which is imprinted as a pattern on the mind, waiting to be awakened by the will. That was a revelation for me, because I grew up thinking that Christ was just Jesus' last name. But really, Christ is a much bigger thing. And so when Cayce talks about Christ consciousness, the Buddha had Christ consciousness. We all have Christ consciousness. It's just how much we're manifesting it. And Jesus is our Western example of that, a very wonderful pattern, the readings tell us, for the manifestation of the Christ consciousness. And the people in the Law of One were dedicated to that. He also basically says they're dedicated to the golden rule, treat people the way you want to be treated. All right, so physical descriptions of the Atlanteans. This is where it gets a little weird. Now, they could do this thing with thought forms that really got them trapped at some point. And Cayce says that they actually created monstrosities, combinations of human and animal and even plant characteristics. And of course, we have in some of the old mythologies, the Minotaur, the Centaur, we have evidence of that sort of idea. Of course, they don't say it's Atlantean, but you wonder where those ideas came from. And so, for example, if a person spent time thinking a lot about things where they were kind of bullheaded, they might actually take on some of those animal characteristics. All right, he also mentions things like mermaids, unicorns. Sweet unicorns were a problem that the Atlanteans created. They were monsters in a way. The satyr, and some of the other things that we can see in some of our ancient drawings. And as he said, they became entangled in matter. And there were people who were told in their life readings that they worked in temples that were dedicated solely to helping people get rid of those entanglements. They might have a few feathers still left on their legs, or they might have a tail, or they might have something left from that thought form that they had created over time. Now, all of us would like to believe that we were in the law of one, and I'm sure we were. But what you'll find in the Cayce readings oftentimes are people who were in both, that over 200,000 years they had many lifetimes in Atlantis. And sometimes they were in the law of one, and sometimes they, as Cayce would say, they lost in a lifetime when they went over to the other side. They probably saw the pleasure and the fun and the amusement that was going on the Sons of Belial side. So probably, if we're all honest with each other or with ourselves, we'll have to admit that we're a little bit of both. And so we're probably in this lifetime working out some of that karma for our time that we spent as a son of Belial. All right, other things that he said about the Atlanteans, that they could be at least 10 to 12 feet in height, and they could also be as small as little people or midgets. He said they were well proportioned. He said they were of the red race. They were a mixture people. He said that they were sort of chameleons. They would take on whatever environment they were in, but basically they were identified as the red race. And he actually identified that a lot of Atlantean migrations went into the northeastern part of the Americas and are represented really well in the Iroquois tribes, the 5 nations of the Iroquois. All right, so the third root race is the Atlanteans, and they're just popping along, and they're hardening, and that Sons of Belial are just getting more and more power. And so something has to change. Well, around 106 BC, the Cayce readings tell us that the Christ soul came into the earth in the form of an entity called Amelius/Lilith, because they were both male and female at that time, and also souls that had never come into the earth plane. They were watching what was going on in Atlantis, and they were worried about their fellow souls, and being people who are there for others and concerned about others, they sacrificed themselves really to come into the earth plane in order to help bring the rest of us back. You know, we all would like to believe that we were some of those morning stars that sang in the morning that came with the Christ, but some of us probably were and some of us weren't. But some of us were with the Christ spirit, and maybe we got stuck as well, which is what happened. So the wonderful thing, though, about Amelius and Lilith is that when they came in, they did something unusual. We don't know exactly what it is, but with what we know about genetics right now, they made some change to the human body at that point, and maybe around 60,000 BC. It's really hard to tell in the Cayce readings. But they created what we call the fourth root race, which were the 5 Adams and Eves in 5 places around the world. They were in those 5 places and created at the same time. And the purpose of creating these new bodies or helping these new bodies to develop was so that they could reach their spiritual source, that they could utilize the chakra system more completely and be able to move forward. So he said the brown people were in South America and the Andes, the black in Africa, the white in the Carpathian Mountains, the yellow in the Gobi or China, and the red were Atlantis and Northeast Americas. And why these particular colors and locations? It just has to do with what the environment, the color had to do with what was needed in that environment. So basically, this is a map of where those 5 Adams and Eves, and these are the modern bodies that we have now, were first presented, and we think it was around 60,000 BC, according to Cayce. All right. So what happens next? And James has mentioned a little bit about this. Well, one of the interesting things is Cayce says there's going to be a 5th root race. And he gives us a few clues as to when it might be going to happen. He says in 1943 in a reading, he said it was in the next few years. And he says that there will be people who will need to prepare for a new race. So we don't know if maybe the baby boomers were brought in to prepare for that new race, or if somehow we're some genetic movement toward the fifth root race. He says the fifth root race will have that full consciousness and ability to communicate with the creative forces. The same thing they had back in Lemuria and Atlantis. And the same challenge will apply. What will be our intention? What will we be using that power and ability for? That comes out in the readings over and over again. You know, power is all in how you use it. We can either create positive karma or not so positive karma. And another interesting thing he says is that the people who are at this fifth root race will know that they are, but the people around them won't necessarily know that there's anything different about those people. So maybe, as James says, it will be a new body, but maybe it'll just be a change in consciousness. And so unless you are aware that you're aware, nobody will know that you're somebody from the fifth root race. We know it's going to be happening around this time because he talks about it's during the Aquarian age. He talks about that it's during the time of the earth changes. All right, further information about Atlantis. Everybody knows there were destructions in Atlantis because it doesn't exist anymore. And I love that the popular comics have picked up on it, and as it says, so your flood control bill didn't make it out of committee. Well, it's not the end of the world. Or is it? All right, so we know from Cayce there were 3 destructions of Atlantis. The first one in 50,722 BC, exactly. There was the group of 5 nations that got together: Atlantis, China, India, Egypt, and South America. They had nations. They were around in 50,000 BC. And they got together to exterminate some kind of large animals. They created a huge explosion that either created a volcanic reaction and changed the poles, but it also destroyed the animals. These may be the animals that were around at that particular time. But one interesting reading tells us that those animals got large because of something that the people of that time did. As he says in the reading, he says, in the enormous animals that had lost control by the influences of the powers of suggestion in the associations of the spirit or the sons of men upon the animal world. So again, when we were in Atlantis, we were messing around with the animals, and, you know, it may be a little bit like dog fights today where, you know, you say, well, I'll make my animal bigger than your animal and we'll see how they do, and, you know, on it goes. So again, the misuse of power. And it broke the Atlantean continent up into smaller islands. And the first of the migrations occurred. And the readings talk about that they went, first of all, the Atlanteans that left at that time and some Lemurians who also were affected by this global volcanic event went to the Pyrenees. The Pyrenees, of course, between France and Spain. He also mentions, well, if you're aware of the Basque people in that particular part of the world, you know that their language is not like the regular. It doesn't have the same root with the Indo-European languages. And people have wondered what that was all about. And he also says in 50,000 BC, the Atlanteans and Lemurians went to South America, which he called Og. Or they called Og back in the day. Second destruction was in 28,000 BC. We have 52 readings that tell us about it. And in this one, he says the firestone was tuned too high. In fact, there was an individual who got a life reading, and he was told in that life reading, you were the person that tuned that firestone too high. And I thought, man, I'm so glad I didn't get that reading. Wouldn't you be embarrassed? And 28,000 BC was the peak of the technological capability, according to Cayce, in Atlantis. But what's a firestone? Now, you guys, when I've given this lecture before, I know there's always been people in the audience that didn't know what a firestone was. But I got a feeling you guys know. but I'll go ahead and tell it. In the beginning, it was called the White Stone or the Towie Stone, and it was used for speaking and for communicating with the higher forces, with the infinite, with the divine. It was a very spiritual tool. And of course, as we humans are, when we find out something has power, what do we want to do with it? Yeah, we want to turn it into something for our pleasure, or we want to turn it into a weapon. All right, so again, we had more migrations, this time to the Americas, to Nevada and Colorado, Arizona and Utah. Now, some of those were Lemurians, some of them were Atlanteans. And he talks about in Arizona and Utah that they became the cave dwellers. And Greg and I just this summer were at Painted Rock Petroglyphs in Arizona near Phoenix. It's a wonderful site way out in the boondocks. And they have this ancient migration pathway. You can see on these stones the petroglyphs. And what they understand, what the mainstream people understand about it, is that since at least 10,000 BC, which is the final destruction of Atlantis, there have been people wandering through that area, and they would make their mark on the stones in order to say, I was here, I guess, or to mark maybe for the people coming after them, this is the pathway. But 10,000 BC, they know this site was used. And these are some of the markings. So again, in 28,000 BC, according to Cayce, there were ships in the air, on the water, under the water. We think they had submarines, they had hot air balloons, they had land-based transportation, chariots run by gas, laser surgery, elevators and connecting tubes, electricity, advanced metallurgy, and they could photograph from a distance. They had some abilities. But things began to devolve after that as far as their technology is concerned. But then in 10,000 BC, the final destruction, there's 352 readings that Cayce gave for that time period. And it's never been made clear in the readings exactly what it was that caused that destruction. We know they knew about it in advance because they prepared some records and put them in 3 places around the world. There are also readings that talk about that they went out and looked for places for people to migrate to ahead of time. So it's something that they knew was going to happen. Well, Andrew Collins, who's written several books and I think was here in Hot Springs a couple of years ago at the Earth-Keepers, his theory since really the early 2000s is that it was a comet event. And something that they called the Carolina Bays event, but it's also called the Younger Dryas event. And I think that's pretty significant because Cayce gave a reading about this final destruction. And he says that there weren't really any absolute records kept about it, but he says that record remains in the rocks, or the record in the rocks remains. And I remember seeing that thinking, well, that's just an odd thing. Is he talking about somebody carved some information in a rock? Well, sort of. We know now that there's a line of ash at the 10,000 BC level. It's the Younger Dryas ash line. And I truly believe that's the record in the rocks that Cayce's talking about. That ash line is the kind of thing you would have if there was a comet event. So there was an abrupt climate change. There's a presence of nanodiamonds in this ash, meaning it was a high pressure explosion of some kind. It has high levels of iridium, which had to come from somewhere else. That's not found on Earth. And we know that it caused the extinction of the mammoths and the other mammals, the large mammals, whatever large mammals were remaining. And then we have scientists who have determined that there's quite a large area of impact craters that can be found that date to this time period. It's called the Younger Dryas Boundary or Comet Impact Field. And Greg and I got to see that not too long ago. But this is where they believe that the comet came through, really from up around the Great Lakes and then all down through the southeast. You can find them in the Carolinas. That's where we went. And of course, we went thinking, well, we're going to have to look really hard for these things. And as it turned out, all I had to do was turn on my GPS and turn it to Google Earth as we were going down the road. And lo and behold, on either side, you saw these elliptical shapes in the earth. And what's interesting about them, they're all directional. Their directional orientation is the same. They have a consistent magnetic anomaly, and they have these interesting sand rims on the side. Andrew Collins believes that they were explosions, that the comets actually exploded above the Earth, sort of like at the Tunguska area in Siberia, where they know something out of the ordinary happened in the early 20th century. And rather than it be a meteorite that hit, it was something that exploded above. But all of these circles that you see are from some sort of bombardment, but they don't find evidence of meteorites in it. So we visited a place called Jones Lake, and it's actually a state park. And this is just a model of what it looks like. You can see the sand, and each one of these are oriented the same. The sand is blown out in the same direction, and this is what it looks like up close. So people go and swim, have no idea exactly what they're swimming in. So I think there's a pretty good argument that the third destruction and the final destruction of Atlantis was a comet. And of course, they might have been able to see that comet ahead of time and know that it was coming. So as I mentioned before, one of the things they did is they started to search for other lands because they realized something was about to happen. And they eventually, according to Cayce, they found lands in lots of places. One were the Iroquois lands in the Northeast Americas, the Southwest America, the Yucatan, the Peruvian Andes, Morocco, Egypt, of course the Pyrenees again, the Gobi, and even Australia. I had not seen that reading before. He says that the Atlanteans were first met by the Bushmen in Australia when they came. He talks about the Iroquois being the pure descendants of the Atlanteans. He talks about near Terre Haute, Chicago, and Dearborn, and around the Erie Lake. He says that in Central America, the Atlanteans had something to do with the temples that are being uncovered today. Well, we know the temples that you can find in the Yucatan are primarily the classic Maya, but if you know much about the classic Maya, they built their temples on top of old temples and on top of older temples and so forth. It's sacred land. So somewhere under all of those temples are some Atlantean remnants, and Cayce does talk about that as well. He talks about someone had a reading where they were told that they were preparing for this migration to the Pyrenees, and their journey was through the air. So at that point, they must still have had some way of traveling through the air. Egypt was a really important place for them to go. Of course, they were traveling back and forth. Remember, Egypt was one of those 5 nations that helped with that first destruction where the large animals were destroyed. But he says that Egypt was a really special place. It was a center of universal activities of nature. And he said it was probably a safe place, least likely to have any more disturbance by convulsive movements, he says, that caused the destruction of Lemuria and Atlantis. Okay, this was a reading on the Gobi land. So basically then, there is no Atlantis. And one of the odd things about the Bahamas that I didn't mention earlier, is if you ask a mainstream archaeologist, when were the first peoples in the Bahamas, they'll tell you 500 AD. Now, why would it be 500 AD when when Bimini is only 50 miles from Miami currently, and the seas were higher, so it would have been even closer? We know that in 30,000 BC that the people from Indonesia went to Australia and helped to populate Australia. They were taking boats across. So why wasn't anybody coming across from Florida? And we know Florida, the mainstream people admit there were people in Florida as far back as 8,000 BC. So where were they? Well, what the answer is there's no evidence of people in the Bahamas before 500 AD. So what would happen to destroy that evidence? Well, some pretty big destructions, and maybe something like a tsunami that would just wash everything away. And of course, you have to consider what's going to last. Paper? Nope. Fabric? Nope. Maybe some stone would last. And of course, that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow with the Hall of Records. But Cayce does say there'll be a time when Atlantis will rise again, in the opening of the records. So stay tuned. We'll talk about that tomorrow. And I'm going to leave you then with Greg to tell you the rest of the story that this wonderful mitochondrial DNA is now telling about Atlantis.
Can you hear me? Okay. John Van Auken told me I needed to tell some off-color jokes. I just said that to wake him up. Okay, so one of the things I'm going to talk about here is in this book called Ancient South America, written by myself, my wife, and John Van Auken. For several years in a row, we pretty much cranked out a book each year. And what I want to talk about here is Edgar Cayce's timeline of Atlantis and Mu or Lemuria migrations, and how we might prove that. So, Cayce said the Americas were inhabited prior to 50,000 BC. All right, so Cayce's migrations. The Americas were inhabited before 50,000 BC. Then in 50,000 BC and 28,000 BC, they went to South America, the southwest of America, and the northeast. He specifically mentioned Pennsylvania and Ohio. Again, in 28,000 BC, he said Atlanteans went to the southwest of America and the Andes Mountains. He also mentioned that, strangely, people from China and the South Pacific came to America, and that's the way he said it, China and the South Pacific. Then in 10,000 BC, Atlanteans moved to the Iroquois lands, to the Yucatan, South America, Egypt, etc. So how do we evaluate this? When Cayce said these things, mainstream archaeology believed at that time no one had been in North America or South America before 4,000 BC. That was the belief then, and anything else was preposterous. Nobody was in the Americas before 4,000 BC, and everything Edgar Cayce said was ridiculous. Well, here's how we prove it. Genetics. And look, genetics is not what it seems. And what I'm about to go through here, you have heard about ancient DNA. You've heard about alien DNA. They've gone into Peru and taken the Paracas skulls and they say, okay, it's alien DNA. And it is alien DNA. Almost all of the ancient DNA research being done now is on non-human DNA. But it's found in us. You have more non-human DNA in you than you have human DNA. But it's very, very interesting. Whoever designed us, whoever designed this system, did some amazing work. It's incredible. So, ancient DNA. How do we get to all this? It actually, all ancient DNA research starts with ancient Native Americans. It all did. And it's a remarkable story. There's got to be some people in here working in healthcare, right? Okay. My initial area in training was psychopharmacology, and one of my little areas of interest was genetics. And when I got into this, I went, oh my God, this is incredible. And I wish they'd known it when I was in school, because I'd probably be a geneticist now, in more ways than one. Okay, so all this started, all of the research on ancient DNA started about 35 years ago. And it started at Emory University in Atlanta, Georgia. They were given grants by the National Institute of Health to try and find out why Native Americans had these high incidences of genetic disorders. For example, the Pima Indian tribe in the southwest of America has the highest rate of obesity of any given group in the world. It is so bad that their babies are being born with type 2 diabetes. If you're in healthcare, you've probably never heard that before, that a baby, an infant, when it's born, has type 2 diabetes. It's unreal. They also have foot disorders, very serious foot disorders and vision disorders, all of which are genetic. So the National Institutes of Health decided, we want to find out what these are. And this was really the beginning of the initial genetic research on before the human genome was totally sequenced. So what they did, they went to Native American tribes and they collected samples of, mainly they started with hair and then swabs from the inside of their mouth. The best way to test DNA is to use teeth. So if you see us walking around pulling teeth from people, that's what we're doing. And the more of them you give up, the more we can find out about you. All right, so what they did is they decided they needed to look at two things. They chose what is called nuclear DNA, human nuclear DNA, nDNA. That is your DNA. But they needed a control sample, something else to look at. And it's called mitochondrial DNA, or mtDNA, and I haven't explained this yet, so let's explain it. Human cells. Human cells. When I say the average human has 40 trillion cells, I can imagine Jethro Bodine, one of my all-time heroes, sitting there starting with naught, and counting cells. 1, 2, up to 40 trillion. Well, anyway, they tell us that we have 40 trillion cells. Okay, so let's accept that we have about 40 trillion cells. And all of those cells, every single one, with the exception of red blood cells, have inside of them the human genome, the genetic code, all of your DNA. And our cells replicate regularly. It used to be that they said every 7 years, every cell in your body duplicated itself, and after 7 years, you're not the person you were. Well, now they say it's 10 years. Every 10 years, you're not the person you were. And when I was in school, if there's some physicians in here, they were probably told the human brain cells never replicate, and now we know that's not exactly true either. Although you don't want to kill too many brain cells. It's not a good idea. So let's take a quick look at cell structure, because in order to understand mitochondrial DNA, you have to understand what it means and where it comes from. So this is the interior of a cell, all right? In the inside, pretty much in the middle they have it drawn here, is a thing called the nucleus of a cell. The average cell is about 1/10,000th of an inch in diameter. Small, very, very small. And about 10% of the space inside of a cell is the nucleus. And about 10% of the space in a nucleus has the DNA in it, your chromosomes and so on. Out here in the exterior of the cell, it's still inside of it. I shouldn't say exterior of the cell. The exterior of the nucleus is fluid. It's a lot like salt water. And in it, you can see, I can't see where it says, does that say mitochondrion? Yes. Okay, a single mitochondria is called a mitochondrion, and the multiple or the plural is mitochondria. So let's keep going. So you take a person here, a human, and then there's one cell, and inside the nucleus you have chromosomes, which actually, I used to do this, I can't do it here because you couldn't see it. I used to do this talk, and I had a long rubber band. And what I would do is I would spin this rubber band around and around. And as I did, it got tighter and tighter and tighter. And if you've ever done that, you see it starts forming clumps. As it pulls together, it clumps together. And the clumps get smaller and smaller, and it gets tighter and tighter. That's how human DNA is wound up. It's actually a double helix, which is a fancy word for something that looks like a ladder that's twisted. That's what it is. It's made up of 3 billion links of one amino acid clicking against another amino acid. So they're like the rungs of a ladder, all right? Remember, these are inside every cell. Very small. The cell's only 1/10,000th of an inch. The nucleus takes up 10% of the cell, and the part in the interior where the DNA is takes up 10% of that. If you could actually unfold, this is why most DNA research, ancient DNA research, is not done with human DNA. I'm about to tell you. If you got into that cell and you were able, which they actually do this, you were able to unwind it, what would happen is it would be 6 feet long. 6 feet. Unbelievable. And every cell in the body, with the exception of the red blood cells, has this. So obviously, when they sequenced the human genome, that means they took this thing apart and they know what all the amino acid links are. Now, if you understand what I'm about to tell you, you'll be able to understand all of the DNA research they're calling ancient DNA research. And when you hear on the TV shows, they say, well, we found a type of DNA that doesn't match any known humans. And they do find DNA that doesn't match any type of humans, but they're not talking about this nuclear DNA. Nuclear DNA is hard to sequence in ancient remains. It's fragile. How do you take apart something that's been inactive and dried out for, say, thousands of years in a grave? And you're trying to look at 6 or 3 billion clicks of amino acids together? All right, so let's look at what they really do. And I am just fascinated with what I'm about to tell you, the mitochondria. Incredible what this is. If you have diabetes and you take insulin, everybody knows what we use for energy, right? It's, what do we use for energy? Pardon? Most of you are going to say carbohydrates or sugar or glucose, something like that. It's not true. We don't burn sugar. We don't do it. We don't. In fact, it's more like rusting it anyway, but we don't burn sugar. There's these little creatures called mitochondria. Every single cell, they're called organelles, and I'll tell you why in a minute, but every single cell in your body, even the red blood cells, and they're only showing 5 or 6 here, which is not true because every cell you have has somewhere between 100 to 500 of the mitochondria in it, just floating around, doing what they do. What do they do? Well, this is actually an electron microscope image of one. Okay, what they are, they call them organelles. They're probably a vestigial bacteria. They're found in dinosaur bones, every type of animal you know of. They're also found in plants. The mitochondria probably developed a symbiotic relationship with multi-celled organisms long ago, billions and billions of years ago. And the ones inside of us, what they do, they ingest sugar or glucose or carbohydrates, depending on what you want to call it. So they ingest those, and a byproduct of their digestive system and their output is called ATP, adenotriphosphate, and that is the energy that we use. Without them, we wouldn't exist. But they're bacteria. Like all bacteria, they multiply. This is where you need to really pay attention, because if you can get this for just a few minutes, you'll understand everything that people are telling you about DNA research. All right, well, we have, whoa, where did that come from? All right. Click through. All right, so we have humans, we have these 3 billion bits on our rungs. They have only 16,000. Ours is tightly wound up. Like I said, a rubber band, you pull it together and it really creates knots in it. Theirs is in a perfect circle, and they're incredibly easy to sequence. There's only 16,000 of them. When I say 16,000, I mean there's only 16,000 amino acids clicking together. And when cells replicate, and when they replicate, these things separate out and duplicate themselves. When they duplicate themselves, inevitably, there's errors. The wrong amino acid gets stuck in there. And we've found a lot of those. Certain types of cancer are caused by that. Human DNA duplicates regularly. Remember, I told you, all your cells are replaced roughly every 10 years anyway. So they've duplicated over and over and over. And it's duplicating 3 billion bits. There's duplication errors, replication errors, and those are called mutations. Well, got to check my time here. Okay. This is where it gets interesting. People say, oh, it's your DNA from your mother. Yeah, it is. I don't know why everybody points here. That side is ignored all the time. I'll get your side too. All right, so human DNA is on the far left side of this graph. So there you are. You got your DNA from your mother and your father. They got theirs from their mothers and fathers, and they got theirs from their mothers and fathers, and on and on and on and on and on, all the way back through time. So you're kind of a mixture, an admixture of all those people in the past. Not so with mitochondrial DNA. It only comes from the female side. We men contribute nothing, which is what we're good for. We are designed to contribute nothing, and that's what we try to do. We fulfill that role. But there you are, and I'll explain why this is so. I'll explain why. So there you have you. The father, he does nothing. He's out golfing or whatever, watching football, drinking beer. That's what he's doing. And the mother gives all the mitochondrial DNA. She got hers from her mother. And she got hers from her mother. And that goes all the way back to the first female. And she was Eve. Don't laugh, it's true. They've called the books actually call them Eve. So here I'll show you guys. There you are. You got your DNA from your mother and father. They got theirs from their mothers and fathers. They got theirs and all the way back through time. Here's the mitochondrial DNA. There you are. You got it from your mother, from her mother, and from her mother, all the way back. It's a female lineage. It's not fair. I guess fairness is a part of this. But let me tell you why. Let me tell you why it happened that way. Okay, at the moment of conception, a sperm cell enters an egg, right? The sperm cell has very few mitochondrial in it, but the egg is in the mother's body. And the egg has more mitochondria in it. As soon as the sperm cell fertilizes that egg, the immune system of the mother and the immune system that's already in that egg attacks the male sperm and kills it. Thank you, I'm done. That is why it's female lineage. It's not our fault. So, all of this ancient DNA research started from Emory University's work back in 1985. And they were testing the Native Americans' DNA, and they chose mitochondrial DNA to test also. They wanted a second type of variable as a control, and they had no idea what they were going to find. They thought that all the mitochondrial DNA that Native Americans, living Native Americans had would be exactly alike. Why? Because, well, all bacteria looks alike, right? Yeah, that bacteria looks like that one. Their DNA must be the same. It's like the Three Stooges. Yeah, it's all the same. It can't be different. And they really did. They really thought it was all going to be exactly the same. And it wasn't. They found 4 types. And being men and being very logical and knowing, okay, what do we call them? How about A, B, C, and D? Yeah, that's it. They found 4 distinctive variations in the mitochondrial DNA that were very easy for them to look at and figure out, okay, that one's different from that one. Yeah, that one's different from that, and they're all different. 4, A, B, C, and D. And so they immediately, archaeologists found out about this, and there was a lot more money available then for research. And so what did they do? They instantly went over to Siberia, and they pulled DNA from Siberian natives. Brilliant. How much time do I have according to? Not quite, but almost. All right. Okay, so they pulled the DNA from them, and they found, lo and behold, the Siberians had A, C, and D. And you go back and read the articles in the late 80s, and it's astonishing if you read what the archaeologists write about this. In the late 80s, they say, we have absolute proof they all came from Siberia. Now we know all the Native Americans, all their ancestors came from Siberia. Little problem, they didn't find any haplogroup B there, the B. So, it was in the 90s, the early 90s, they found haplogroup B in the South Pacific, in like Australia, Melanesia, Micronesia, New Zealand. They also found it in Taiwan and in Japan. And they said, well, Japan's in Asia, it's in Southeast Asia, and so is Taiwan. So obviously, they went up through Siberia and came over too. So that is, again, absolute proof. So read the articles in the journals back then, and they all say, okay, now we have total, complete proof. All Native Americans came from there, came from Siberia. Another piece came up. They suddenly realized, where did these mutations come from? This is incredible. It's a time machine. It really is. Mitochondrial DNA is literally a time machine. Because it has so few clicks, so few connections, the 16,000, they can figure out how long it takes for it to mutate. How long does it take for mutation? And what they came up with, I'll tell you in a minute, it's now much more variable than it was then. But they could figure out when one mutation happened and then go back and figure out when the prior one happened and go back and figure out when the one happened before that. And so what they came up with, they figured that the first Americans, that's the term that they like to use, entered the Americas probably around 20 to 30,000 years ago. The mutation rate, they thought, was somewhere that it mutated, a major mutation occurred every 4,600 to 7,600 years. I'm putting that up just because there might be somebody here that would say, well, you didn't say what the mutation rate was. And then the most remarkable coincidence of all, X, the unknown, occurred. And it was in 96 and 97 when they were testing more and more Native Americans, and they were finding A, B, and C, and D, and then all of a sudden a new one came up in 3% of living Native Americans. They hadn't found it in Siberia, they hadn't found it anywhere else. And we're men, men were doing the research, and what's the logical thing you do then? What's unknown? We'll call it X. X, the unknown. They had no idea then that they were going to also have a B, C, D, E, F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, N, O, P, Q, R, S, T. They had no idea that they were going to find all these others. But X, the unknown, was the 5th one, and it is a remarkable coincidence. They found it, they didn't know where it came from, and they couldn't find it in Siberia, but it suddenly popped up. Europe started doing the same research. It popped up in Europe and living Europeans, and they said, well, nah, it's not ancient. It had to come from an admixture of the historic settlers that moved in, interbreeding with the Native American men. It had to be white women interbreeding with Native American men, because remember, it's only on the female side. So it had to be. So they said, it's still, our theory about them all coming from Siberia and Asia is still true. Well, no, sorry, it's not. A bunch of more things started popping up. Geneticists then realized that mitochondrial DNA, they were testing some remains that were 50,000 years old. They've even talked about testing dinosaur mitochondrial DNA. And that actually may well be possible. But so they started pulling out all of the burial remains, the skeletal remains they'd pulled from mounds and peat bogs and all sorts of places, and said, well, I wonder what they were. That was their mistake, going too far. So in 2002, Haplogroup X was found in ancient remains. One was a Florida peat bog. They pulled a skeleton out of a Florida peat bog. It dated to 5300 BC. By the way, that place had a lot of very tall skeletons at it. The Brazilian Amazon, they found more. In mounds in Illinois, Washington State. By the way, Kennewick Man, you've probably heard of. Kennewick Man is Haplogroup X. More and more studies came out showing Haplogroup X was a founding lineage, X the unknown, and they knew that it was probably older than the others, but they didn't know where it came from. Remember I told you it's a time machine. All of these others now, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, all the way through to X, they know where they came from. How did they do that? It's fascinating. You pull out a whole lot of skeletal remains from all over the world, and then you rank order them based upon what their age is. So you get skeletons from, say, Bosnia from 1,000 years ago, Bosnia from 10,000 years ago, and 20,000 years, and so on. Do the same thing in all other places, put it in a huge database, and you can see where these came from. Now, there's more than 40. A lot of these have subs, like Haplogroup B has a B1A, B1B, B1C, B2A, B2, and so on. They're all mini mutations. Oh, but it makes it really interesting. So you can go back in time, back and look at each mutation back in time, and you can figure out where that mutation began. Where did these people come from? All right, so where's Haplogroup X from? It's the only one today that has no known origin. Still don't know. Archaeologists say, well, it had to come from somewhere, but they just say, well, it had to. They don't really know. The American version is called, and you'll hear this, well, the stuff in Europe's different from America. Yeah, it's just a different age. They split back at a certain time. We call it X2 and X2A. It's in the Orkney Islands of Scotland. That's one of the heavy, other than around the Mediterranean, specific places in the Mediterranean, the Orkney Islands of Scotland is where it's in its heaviest. It's been found in France, Spain, the Mediterranean, Israel, Lebanon. There's one group in Lebanon, religious group, that calls themselves the Law of One, that's actually roughly 60% Haplogroup X in there. There's living groups of people. It's been found in the Gobi Desert. Never been found in Siberia. Never. Not one case. And it just drives archaeologists crazy. So the mainstream estimate in this is what you'll see if you get online. You will see that they tell you that, these are some of the others, how they hopped to America. Of course, everybody came out of Africa as far as they're concerned. And then as you see these, you'll hit H is down. Is that H? I can't see it, but it's probably H, right? Down in Africa? Okay. So it hops out, and then it mutates and mutates, and then it eventually gets over to the Americas. And they have estimates here, 26 to 34,000 years ago in North America. And that is for A, C, and D, and partly B. And then they show them going down into South America. There's very little X in South America, but the X that's there is actually exactly where Cayce said they would be. So that's the mainstream belief, or that's what they try to make you believe, but it's not accurate. So let's look at Cayce's Atlantean migrations. In 2002, John Van Auken over here and my wife and I wrote a book, and we put out a number of articles saying that Haplogroup X, I mean, it's logical. It looks like Atlantean DNA. What do you mean by that? Well, it seems to have come from a central place. And the places where it went is just logical that it went to these places. It has to be from some place that no longer exists because they can't find where it came from. And in a minute, I'll get to another one that archaeologists now say, and geneticists, this comes from a place that no longer exists, and it fits Cayce too. So this is where Cayce said the Atlanteans went. Most heavily in the Iroquois lands, in the southwest of America, in the Yucatan, Mexico. He mentioned Ecuador, the Andes, the Pyrenees Mountains, Morocco, the Gobi Desert, Egypt, and Australia. All of those places. And the little red dots are where Haplogroup X is. In Native American mounds, in the skeletal remains found from burials of Native American mounds in the Northeast, which mounds are my biggest interest in all this, Haplogroup X is up to 50% of the skeletal remains, which is astonishing. It's almost gone today. It's only 3%, like I said, of living Native Americans. The little dot out here is Kennewick Man. Can't hold this steady. Kennewick Man's out here near Washington State. But it's in the only place here where it's not that Cayce said that there were some was in Australia. Hasn't been found in Australia, but the truth is there's been no ancient remains tested in Australia. None at all. There are places where there hasn't been much testing that's gone on. So, it appears that, like it says Atlantis in the Atlantic there, all the places where it is, where's the logical place that it came from? How did it get to both continents? And we know it dates back to at least 15,000 years ago. There is one variation of it that dates to 10,000 BC. Large groups of people came into North America in 10,000 BC. And for years, from roughly 1937 to the present, American archaeology told us that the Americas were occupied by a group of people called Clovis that came into North America and just took it over in 10,000 BC. Of course, they came from Siberia, according to them anyway. All right, I'll show you one more. Haplogroup B. I'm at the end, close to the end. Haplogroup B is exceedingly interesting too. And at first, I just knew that it's in the South Pacific. We know now, if you look at this graph, we know that Haplogroup B, a specific kind, was in the South Pacific. Those are the people that probably came into South America more than 50,000 years ago. And that's not just me saying it. There's a lot of, everything I'm telling you, other than the Atlantis link to it, is out of the genetics articles. They believe that somebody from Haplogroup B came over, large groups came from Australia and New Zealand and came to South America. I'm working on a project with writer Andrew Collins in England, and we know the following. South America was inhabited long before North America was. It had almost everything first. And if you actually read the South American textbooks, they say that North American archaeologists want to be first. We were first. And North American archaeologists have controlled all the money for a long time. And South American archaeology depends upon money coming from up here. But it's now known that Haplogroup B did enter into South America a long, long time ago. And the weird thing is, you're starting to see this. We took this photo at a museum in Arkansas. I saw James just come in. By the way, lots of giant skeletons recovered in Arkansas, and the one mound that produced more than any other mound in the United States is in Arkansas, and even archaeologists have said that it did. Don't know how many 7 to 8 footers were there, but dozens. One mound. Chickasaba Mound. Chickasaba is in Blytheville, Arkansas, next to the former Blytheville Air Force Base. Still there, as a matter of fact. All right. So there are now, American archaeologists are now saying, okay, so they came to South America by a southern route, which is unheard of. If you actually get on the websites of the federal government showing you what the ocean currents were and are, all you got to do, if you get in a boat in New Zealand and you just let it float, you're going to go right along Antarctica and you're going to go right up the coast of South America. Of course, you're going to have to be able to get some food and water along the way. But life's filled with problems. Anyway, all right, so to just conclude, Haplogroup X is older. The one in North America is older than what's over in Europe and what's around the Mediterranean. So that fits Cayce. They came here first. Haplogroup X entered America from the east. That's pretty obvious, and it's now known by some archaeologists, and the Smithsonian believe that it came in from the east. They were called the Solutreans as far as they're concerned. But the Solutrean culture in Europe, which I don't have time to discuss, probably is Atlantean. Haplogroup B, the one that came into South America, is older than X. And it came into the Americas well before 50,000 BC, which is what Cayce said. Came from the South Pacific, which is what Cayce said. And this, I pulled recently an article in Genetics where they're trying to trace where did this version of Haplogroup B come from. And they literally say, well, it obviously comes from a no longer existing place, which Lemuria or Mu or Sundaland, but they literally say it comes from a no longer existing place. So they're starting to incorporate some old legends and beliefs that crazy people like us think about. All right. I am done. I thank you. That's hopefully you know everything.
Thank you so much. Let's have another round of applause for Dr. Gregory Little, please.